for this special lecture. It is my duty to formally introduce our special guest, Dr. Gangadharan. Sir?
Yes, ma'am.
Sir currently teaches in the Department of History, Faculty of Social Science, Banaras Hindu University, Varanasi. He has done his PhD under the supervision of Professor K.N. Panikar and Sabyashi Bhattacharya, Center for Historical Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, on the intellectual development of colonial Tamil Nadu. Sir's area of interest, globalization and its influence in historical perspective, history of the science and technology, caste, gender, and identity issues, cutting-edge methods in social science research, social exclusion and inclusive policy, and disability studies. He also published a corpus of articles, of which the latest on his The Engendering Cultural Aspirations, Essays on the Intellectual History of the Colonial Tamil Nadu. Sir has been served as a visiting professor in the program of Asian Study in the University of Buffalo, New York State, under MOE between Banaras Hindu University and University of Buffalo in 2011. Sir also served a member of the Oxford Center for the Religious Studies, and he supervised more than 15 PhD theses. He has served as an executive member of the Indian History Congress. With this, I welcome you, sir, for this special lecture. Over to you, sir.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, madam, for giving a very energetic introduction. And at the outset, let me express my sincere thanks to the head of the Department of History, Professor Anuradhaji, for giving me an opportunity to address this audience. And of course, it has been a great pleasure to accept LFH, Loyola Forum for Historical Studies. And I mean, you have been doing a wonderful work. I think so it's a great pleasure to sharing issues on where we have a lot of common concerns, and as well as addressing a new audience for me. I think so I've been teaching for the past 2 decades history across the country, though I may not have a chances to address this side of an audience on this mode of communication. Well, whatever may be done, but the fact of the matter, it comes at the right time when things come into place. I think so I'm trying to use a bit of slides because that is the order of the day nowadays. So however much we teach, I think so students generally, rate you in terms of your ideas and sometimes in terms of the images you show. Perhaps I think so I want to draw a middle path. I think so the very seminar also seems to have taken up the topic echoing the subaltern sentiments or the subaltern voices, rather than representing or radically taking a challenge to claim. So I think so it's an interesting topic to be, initiate a new discussion rather than claiming the places for subalterns. I think so echoing the voices of the subalterns. Perhaps this would be the beginning. In due course of time, I'm sure, as I said, instead of echoing, rather time might come that you may have to claim. And that's what history has been so far taught us to do so. I think so there are some of the quotations that I've been using it primarily to drive my point of sharing, my point of presenting the thought, which I think would be very relevant in terms of understanding the central crux of the overall discourse that I'm currently engaging in. So as you see it, particularly the famous statement that, everywhere in these days, it has become almost an order of the day that you may start with Foucault or Derrida, or for that matter, anyone who belongs to that class of writing like Bourdieu, or for that matter, even Jacques Lacan and others. So what I particularly, emphasize on how power matters. I think it's more material, physical, corporal than anything else. And it is really comes into power, into action when we begin to really look into the pages of history and particularly engage with the debating on historiographies. So therefore, I feel this is an initial startup point that I would try to argue on how power matters in terms of what we share and speak and write about it. Secondly, the much, rather questioned or debated name Marx, whose main famous statement that makes it clear that I would rather emphasize that needs to be considered that men make their history or men make their own history not in the way they wanted or as do they please. Rather, they make it under circumstances not chosen by them but given or transmitted through the ages. Perhaps that 18th Brumaire statement turns out to be even today more relevant that we do what we do, not because we are willing to do it, because we are forced to do it, or we have been in the place to do it. And that's how all these things come into form or come into fruition. Perhaps this is an area that I would be also spending a little time to explain how we become somewhere down the line actors as well as factors in making and shaping the historical developments. So thirdly, that what you see it, I think so the inaugural speaker Sainath also touched upon this point. This until the lions have their own historian, the history of the hunt will naturally glorify the hunter. Perhaps this is more to do with the who represents who or who speaks for whom. That is where I think so the main crux of your seminar lies today. And as we know, this Chinua Achebe, the Nigerian novelist, when he was talking in the Paris Review, where he mentioned this particular idea to make the point clear in the way he understood to a tribal setup of Nigerian context. Perhaps we may take up this aspect to Indian context in different ways. So then finally, the important point that I would also try to emphasize is the Paul Valéry, the French poet, who used a very well-known statement that history is the most dangerous portion or dangerous poison that has ever concocted in the laboratory of human mind. I mean, history as such, perhaps this is where I think the people in this part of the country, the southern part of India, mainly has to recognize the implications that history carry over the ages. Because it can become a dangerous portion once if you do not treat it well. As we know well, radio material or radium material, when you once you use it and if you throw it out, it will become naturally more dangerous than it has been kept in other place. So history also somewhere operates like a radiomatic race, and it can have its adverse impact at any circumstances. Perhaps one of the important challenges I think so that we need to really consider today, or I would like to lay before you for your serious cogitation that we need to look back not only our history, we also look into our history as of now it evolves, and as we want the future of history, how we should go. In all these areas, there has to be an interrelated, coordinated, organic attempt to do it, or organic attempt to relate these ideas together. Perhaps that is where I understand the logic of understanding history requires a new paradigmatic understanding, failing which it may not make a greater sense. So, let me elaborate this point, particularly what I'm emphasizing is that the history of the society cannot be just rescued overnight. It can be only only can be rebuilt or reconstructed over the period, and that is the only way through which we can certainly engage with the study of historical activities. So, what I would like to particularly throw light on at the beginning, the subaltern voices that we have been talking about it. before entering into the main plank of the argument, I may like to mainly touch upon the subalternity or the subaltern nature of historical writing as such. I'm sure your brochure has very clearly outlined the very historical background to the development of subaltern studies. Much more than to that, I could add up that, see, the moment the idea that we talk about subalternity are the people, those who belong to the history of the lower rung. So the assumption with the subalternity began has to be seriously considered. I know very well, I'm sure many of you know, Ranajit Guha, who was the brain behind the entire development, actually began his journey from a communist movement as a student leader, later moved on in various European countries, come to a settlement at this later 50s, and then end up in starting up this major study called as Subaltern Studies. Subaltern Studies is an important initiative which came in the 1970s with a set of students who work under him and who was able to later develop that into a major historical perspective. But the historical perspective that he started off had a philosophical understanding that it wants to challenge the dominant historiographic sense of that particular period, that is to do with the Marxism. So Marxist historiographic writing had its initial sway over the entire historiography of India. And that's how his concern was immediately confined to contest and challenge the overarching power of Marxist perspective. And therefore, his initial, grammar of subaltern study very much evolved as a counter narrative to Marxist tradition. Perhaps a holistic or what we may call a generic subaltern study could have been not on that way of just only challenging Marxist perspective, but also providing a capacious space for a variety of understanding and other perspectives. So whatever may be the fact of the matter, but the things the way it went. So we know well, subaltern study has naturally and generated serious interest in the way that Indian historiography needs to be relooked at. The subaltern historiography has set a limit for itself by interpreting the nature of the historical writing. What I mean to say is that subaltern studies primarily wanted to create a counter narrative or alternative narrative, or the people who have hitherto been disempowered. That was their expectation or their anxiety to address. But as a matter of fact, choice of sources, that is where I think so the question comes to our serious consideration. How do we refer, or how do we relook at the history that we have gone through? So perhaps one of the important bottom lines that I think particularly the subaltern group initially made was that all the colonial governmental sources were necessarily biased. That means history is all about sources, and therefore if the sources are from a particular background, naturally the information can also be equally biased. Perhaps the same subaltern group later realized that government sources also can be liberated from the authority or the hegemonic power of the state through the method of interpretation. That is where I think so Derridian understanding comes to play an important role, making sooner or later subaltern studies to take into linguistic turn rather than historical approach. In fact, it was this shift, in fact, rather led to the decline of subaltern studies within the subaltern framework. Perhaps I think so Smith Sarkar, as earlier as in the beginning of the period itself, has referred to it how the declining of subaltern studies within the subaltern framework taking place. When you look into this whole discussion of the ideas, as we see as Edward Said, who has been the brain behind as far as his appreciation is concerned, who was in fact with his cultural imperialism mainly emphasized how imperialism works as a practice in terms of policy application rather than any other aspect. Whereas the most important thing, what I would like to mainly emphasize, Saidian approach, imperialism is more of a policy or is a more of a sentiment than of a policy. That is to say, the shaping of culture naturally necessitates the hegemonic authority of a state. And that is how the colonial authority or the Company Raj, followed by the Crown, were successfully ruled India not by power alone, but also the hegemonic practice that went along with that, which gave them the considerable consent to continue to have their governing authority rather than having a moral or political control. So, therefore, what I would like to particularly emphasize, the Saidian model would be very much welcome at the outset, but certainly while looking to a diverse society like in India, where history itself was already in the contesting process, and therefore it led to a major, complicated development. What I mean to say complicated, the moment you enter into the historical study in India, the important question is how to address the question of community, which does not either fall into the category of class or for other any ethnic divisions, because caste turns out to be a subsuming power, subsuming paradigmic structure that can take anything within it. So that's one of the challenges that anyone who writes on Indian history needs to recognize. That's where I think, to the best of my understanding, in spite of 12 wonderful volumes of essays, come with the different notions and different dimensions, are not adequately successful enough in handling the central crux of the caste related issues. That is one of the reasons why I understand that subaltern study as a discipline within the historical paradigm has not commanded greater expected dominance as it has been now. So, therefore, what I would like to particularly emphasize from the time of the historical beginning, as we see on the basis of the existing evidences, till today, one of the compelling issues that we currently face in India is how to address the question of community with regard to identity. So this is why I particularly emphasize the desire to rewrite history, the desire to rescue, or the desire to liberate the voices so far have been hushed up needs to be recognized in terms of identity. Perhaps I would be just showing later also, I mean, as you see just now, this Tamil Nadu government's recent rejection of the tabloid. I'm sure the tabloid, I may slightly dwell on this because I think so. It makes sense how North-South divide comes not only because of politics, but also out of what you say, our own semantics of understanding. When you see particularly the tabloid, when it was initially made, I think so Velu Nachiyar, Kuili, and Periyar and others have been included. And unfortunately, in the bureaucracy sitting in Delhi, could not have a clear idea about whom they have been. In fact, they would have rather associated with Jhansi Rani. And if you look at it, Jhansi Rani, who happened to be the local ruler of the Madhya Pradesh region, who was actually fighting for her own survival when Dalhousie introduced the lapse doctrine. Perhaps she had to fight as a fait accompli in the name of her kingdom, that who over the period became a martyr. Why she became a martyr? Primarily because it represents a group interest. And as you know well, after 150th year of India's War of Independence celebration, we come to know Jalkari Bai happens to be one of the Dalit leader who also equally valiantly fought with Jhansi Rani. What I mean to say is that the history of the northern part of India that becomes this main history of India today also took its own time to come into limelight. Whereas what I would say, what has been now rejected by Velu Nachiyar or Kuili could have been initial beginning. Perhaps it would be the what I mean to say, tip of the iceberg that may come over the period, and I'm sure in due course of time this would also get recognized. That is why we start echoing sentiments necessarily leads to claiming, and claiming always helps in terms of establishing. That is how the process of history takes place. Perhaps this is why I understand sometimes the Toynbeean famous statement that history repeats. Not because of the events, because we know well history is very much dictated by time and space, and time never repeats. And therefore, that particular cliche cannot be accepted. But nevertheless, the perspectives that revolve around this particular concept can certainly be applied to Indian context very much. So from there, what I would like to particularly point on, see how history writing has been taken up. That's one of the important issues that will enable us to further problematize how the voices of the subaltern has been hitherto neglected or not have been given adequate space, primarily because who writes history? For what? I think so. That's where I think so. Carol French, the biographer of Marc Bloch, the well-known French historian, emphasizes that history is written with a particular purpose. And I think so. Southgate, in his famous work, Why Bother with History, also emphasizes it is the purpose-driven history very often mislead even the factual writing of the historical argument. If you look at the history of history, it enables us to understand the logic or the genealogy of history, how it come into being. That may enable us to understand the nature of how do we interpret history. As you know well, history also had its own initial days of struggle to get a recognition. By 6th century BC, that we look into the Ionian Greek society, where knowledge has been has been already recognized. Eratosthenes, Anaximander, and others have already codified the ideas of mathematics, physics, and other ideas. And when history comes, history as a subject has been looked more as a memory that has no strong evidence to sustain facts and theories. Perhaps this is when I think so Herodotus, who happens to be the father of the Western historiography, in fact brings up an interesting idea that the investigation, in fact, the original term history certainly refers to the idea of investigation. So what Herodotus actually initiated was history has to be investigated. I mean, whatever has been investigated and thoroughly authenticated, then it can be accepted as historical facts. The idea of fact as the datum of knowledge has initially brought from this particular understanding. That's why Herodotus, if you look into the histories that is available online now also, you can see in which he shows how this idea of history needs to be formally recognized through the process of investigation, inquiry. And that is how this whole idea of history began with an idea of creating particular possibility. What I mean to say is that when I say history is written, it's written for what? Becomes the central focal point for our argument. If you take into account the purpose of the history that has been written in the beginning, it was mainly to do with the war and war-related diplomatic history, whether Herodotus followed by Thucydides and others. So therefore, in their focus, it was war and diplomacy that became the central focal point of historical argument. And therefore, it is idea that mattered most. And when the historical writing passed on from Greeks to Romans, they were more serious about rather than creating knowledge than to have power. It is the political quest for power made them to appropriate history, and therefore the question of ideology comes as a matter of dominance. From there, we see in due course of time, religions came, cultures came, societal activities coupled with the intellectual authority over the period, shaped the nature and the course of historical writing, either with the ideas or with the ideology, or sometimes even with the interests. From there, now we moved on into the modern age where history moves on from interest to identity. So, what I mean to say is that, in a nutshell, the history of past 25 years could be read in terms of ideas, or in terms of ideologies, or in terms of interests. And now we have come to understand in terms of identity. Perhaps identity issues or the identity consciousness is very much fundamental to Indian understanding or Indian psyche, because that is why we always write our name with our caste titles or with our family names or with our rural background and other things, because it is the identity marker. It is that particular sense of semantic idea that comes through a semiosis, which in fact finally makes us to be what we are. So therefore, now today, as we talk now history in Indian context, or particularly to the point of subalterns for that matter, of within the subalterns, whether you talk about Dalits, whether you talk about women, whether you talk about disabled, or whether you talk about LGBT, everything somewhere down the line directly linked with the notion of what identity it has given us. So therefore, what I would like to particularly emphasize, when we echoing the subaltern sentiments or subaltern voices, we need to recognize what for this voices needs to be echoed, what for and how, because what we do naturally emanates from what we aspire or expect or demand. And that's how the whole notion of historical writing also now comes to us. Why do we need to do it? And what for we do we need to do it? And when we look into this particular aspect, it becomes very clear and obvious. So therefore, what I particularly emphasize, it was after all a tabloid that could have been easily, chosen or rejected. But certainly, it carries a weightage of a great heritage of claims in which what we may call the spirit of identities lay buried. So that's why rejection of any particular claim can have a serious cultural, psychological injury to a community, not primarily because it has caused great material loss, rather than it costs aspersion to the claims that one makes about it. So therefore, one of the important challenges that we need today recognize is what or why history is being written, or why history needs to be written at all. Perhaps one of the areas that we see as of now, the challenges as of now in the colonial setup like India that has come out from its foreign yoke, has its own way of negotiating, has its own way of reconciling with the reality. Perhaps in the Indian context, the idea of returning back to history, or the idea of recovering the lost history, is not only a matter of identity, but also matter of its own personality. I think so Subbarao writes The Indian Personality, where he talks about the characters of a personality. What I mean to say is that India's primary claim as of now that we see today, the most salient historical perspective that India currently aims to have is that it is a state with the cultural unity, having the capacity to sustain its political diversities. That's one of the reasons why we see whoever in power in Delhi thinks of writing history not as a matter of recognizing the past, but also retaining the nature of the power as it is evolved. So therefore, the question or the challenge that now is, it is not the center that gives the space for the periphery to argue. It is the periphery that makes or creates way for its survival. That's one of the reasons the echoing sentiments may not make sense to the center to the extent you expect. Rather, it needs to put forth or press hard its claims till it be recognized. So that is how historical battle is launched in the intellectual terrain in order to claim one's own identity. So in this regard, particularly if we look at the way in which subaltern history tries to look at the history of current, modern India has its own limitations, primarily because it chose issues that will not make a greater public outcry or political fallout. So that's a major challenge that we see, that I would particularly look at it, the inability to subaltern study, raise enough, public recognition, or for that matter, making it a more recognizable body of knowledge system. Primarily because the issues that it took about somehow about 100 essays or more, if you look at into the 12 volumes, all of them somewhere down the line concerns with the subaltern issues, but not having enough political political fallout that can cause serious repercussions. One of the important things I would particularly argue, as Helen Carr, now the latest, book, What is History Now, the granddaughter of E.H. Carr, she writes about it, is that it is interpretation that matters, but certainly the interpretation needs its own rigor, not in terms of only bringing facts, but also in terms of pushing ideas into the claims that have been made. So means what I'm particularly trying to emphasize as far as this whole notion of claiming history is what has been so far ignored needs to be brought forth for considerations. Perhaps the issues that what center sees seriously, particularly in the main or the major part of Indian historical argument, is that it primarily looks in terms of keeping Indian unity, keeping away from the one more partition experience never to be repeated. So, therefore, what I would like to particularly point out, the center operates its own concerns the way it deals with the past. And it has been also been a center is not a monolithic structure. It also groups that comprises of different element of interests. So therefore, in a multi-diverse cultural society, the idea of intellectual aspirations necessarily emanates from different directions. And that is one of the area, that is how, each group gets its own recognition within the within the communities of nation. So therefore, in Indian context also, we look at this particular development in relation to Indian context, how they have come into being. And when we look into it, there are social dislocations. The social dislocation that we talk of today is not one of simple Indian creation. It is also been equally influenced by the rest of the invading societies that ruled India. What I mean to say, the question that we talk of today, caste, naturally how come from a Vedic past, no doubt about it. But the past that has been generated from there was not one of absolute free from other influences, because India had a set of people who came and ruled and controlled and even influenced India different ways. From the time of Haryana dynasty to the colonial authority, that we could see a set of people, different communities came and ruled and went, and as a result of which, we have a baggage of historical challenges that needs to be recognized while we talk about what history actually comes into being. So therefore, what actually becomes an issue as far as contemporary Indian state turns out to be far different from the other expected constituents, particularly southern part of India, others. And in this regard, also in another area that I would also try to emphasize on, that the contemporary Indian state demands or the expectations of what is to be history is also riven with its own internal contradictions. Because as state power changes, we also see the nature of the historical argument also gives ways for all those things. So therefore, what I mean to say is that there is a weightage of democratic power. At the same time, there has been a great intellectual package that works. And besides, most important, what has been inherited as a cultural heritage of India, in which almost all parts of India has its own equal share. And that is where I think so we need to really relocate, or we need to really relook at the history of India that has so far been understood. Particularly as paucity of time, I may particularly point out one particular area because that area is quite familiar to us. I thought of sharing, including gender, tribe, and Dalit and two castes. Perhaps instead of it, I would do this way. I would try to only touch upon caste to speak about a bit, to understand why the rejections or why this delegitimization of certain group interests come into play in the arena of Indian historical writing. Perhaps if you look at it, the caste question, I may not deeply dwell into the past and its applications of caste system, but certainly how caste system got integrated within the modern Indian state is an important issue that we need to understand. As you know well, the East India Company came ever since its initial days till it ruled, or even the transfer of power took place from company to crown. We know the Pax Britannica was largely dominated by a clarity of understanding of Indian community or Indian society, or their ethnographic model somehow made a classical clinical attempt to divide India in the way they understood. That's why in 19 sorry, that's why in 1871 they made a plain census which did not address their communitarian expectations. When it started in 1881, the formal first census, it actually took caste numbers only in terms of as they have been understood. But in 1891, the knowledge of caste has been brought within the paradigm of what we may call Varna Jati division. And 1901 census actually brought this classification on the basis of native public opinion. This is something and interesting that colonial authority wanted to recognize the sentiments of Indians the way Indians understand. In the process, they know fully well they can create a wedge between communities. In 1911, this whole idea got standardized, and that standardization began to work in terms of Varna and Jati, which did not fit well in the entire part of India, leave alone the south. However, this was carried on. By 1931, Hutton, the well-known sociologist, to the extent, took up a serious study and made us some 30 pages of a long appendices for all census ethnographers to consider before enumerating caste groups. And he introduced a concept called exterior caste for the Dalits, or what we now call, or the untouchables. Perhaps the idea that he wanted to encourage, or the idea that he wanted to rather push through in his census report was that there is a strongly well-knit classified Indian society and a set of people who are outside the pale of that entire system. Perhaps this logic, whether we like it or not, since 1931 till today, we have been almost following, because our reservation policies or our all other state policies are largely based on the population identification that has been done in 1931 census. So therefore, what I'm particularly trying to emphasize is that the caste conflict in which we are embroiled today is not only the creation of our ancestors alone, but also the rulers who have come in between have also contributed to a great extent in complicating as well as convoluting to the system that now we need to really work out, in which how we can address the question of absolute subjection, address the question of sense of recognizing one's own dignity. And that is where the Indian historiography is yet to rise to occasion to face the challenges. Perhaps what is interesting after India's independence, its historical way of recognizing the nature of history writing took its own course. Perhaps in the 1950s and 60s, Indian history largely fought against what we may call anti-communal sentiments and visions and notions. And that has been center of the issue, particularly in northern and northern peripheral regions like Punjab and other places. However, this issue did not make much of a sense in South, though the entire Indian history had to recognize them as a part of entire Indian narrative. This narrative, indeed, over the period, became the parcel of Indian historical tradition. That's why today, if you look at it from 1990s, when the Ayodhya issue came, it it could easily generate a sufficient popular appeal across the country, and the whole event created enough political climate conducive for a popular claim for constructing a temple at this particular disputed site. So what I mean to particularly emphasize is that the historical claim that come into being in the 1990s was not just a creation of a particular splintered group, but entire nation that over the period consider the way in which history was looked at. So this is where I particularly emphasize there has to be a serious intellectual vigilance in terms of how a nation is addressing its own issues in the way in which it's supposed to handle. Perhaps the Nehruvian government and then the group that came after, largely concerned with the question of secularism, which would meet the requirement as they understood in that particular point of view, because creating ample space within the public sphere is sufficient enough to quell the spirit of the discontenting masses. But certainly that is not sufficient. That's what we now understand. But by the beginning of the 21st century, the entire political climate of India changed, giving way to the rise of new expectations and new desires. And that is how the identity groups coming together on a particular cultural platform tries to argue for, rather than a diverse India, a unitarian Indian sense. Perhaps this is their understanding. By creating a unitarian India, one could certainly retain the political salience that they think as their own. But what I particularly emphasize in the committee of people when they live in an under political system, that whether it is in the past or today, we can see that people have equal right to compete, equal right to negotiate as far as one's own space is concerned. And that's why I think so. The current political climate, in spite of its heating up environs, there is enough space to one can articulate and work out for creating space for particular identity claims. So in this regard, I think so particularly the Dalit movement was to a certain extent successful in terms of generating sufficient heat in terms of making intellectual demand for recognition. Perhaps since the 1990s, after the celebration of 100th year birth of Ambedkar, I think so things in the intellectual ambience began to make some sense of influence. And now today we see Dalit activism reached a point in which it is able to speak for itself. Perhaps can subalterns speak for themselves? I think so. Gayatri Spivak raised this question in the 1980s. Today we can say, provided if each group makes an effort, they could speak. Not only, they can certainly fight for their rights. So that is why the question of advocacy does not come from someone else. It comes from within. And that's how advocacy necessarily creates sufficient space for actual claim for one's own right. And that, I think so, to a certain extent, in different directions taking place in Indian situations. Even for that matter, women's question or gender history, of course, needs to go a long way. Nevertheless, there has been an initiative, and that initiative has deeply well in, and I hope it will certainly get reflected in the way we understand history, in the way we recognize the role of gender in terms of what history has been so far to us. So therefore, what I would like to particularly emphasize that when we talk of when different groups are fighting or working for their own claims, it is essential that we need to create an ambience in which ideas can be thrown over. And that is where what I particularly feel postmodernism, in spite of its limitations, is an interesting initiative that comes to help post-colonial society like ours to address issues of different sort. Perhaps if had it not been the postmodernist outlook, today the third gender issue could not have come to Indian context in the public fora or to speak about it, or for that matter, the recognition of LGBT rights. We need to go a long way, but there is a flickering hope that looms at large that can be certainly salvaged with the reclaiming of the history that has been so far denied. So that's one of the reasons why we understand the nature of history that we talk of now will enable us to fight not only for rights, but also not only for the claims, but also to create an equal citizenry in which rights of everyone be accepted as it is and as it requires for them. So that is how a nation that come into a new political understanding supposedly work out. And no arithmetically acceptable nation in which idea of interests are recognized. All of them are worked out, in which particular group may gain, particular group may lose it. But as a matter of fact, as long as there is a scope for negotiation, there is a possibility. And that's what I particularly find it in Indian situations, whether we talk about Father Staines, or for that matter, Varavara Rao, or for that matter, uh, various other issues that we can certainly think policies of differences continues to have its own repercussions in the way we understand history, but certainly it cannot absolutely shut down the way in which we try to rewrite our own life and future and the days to come. So therefore, it is fundamental and pertinent to us to recognize how to push through ideas that hitherto have been not recognized. So means historians' great task is to bring forth new sources, new ideas, new information to the fore, so as to we may dwell on to create new possibility for hitherto disempowered group to claim their own rightful positions. Unless until we create the history of our own, we cannot certainly claim what we think as the rest for us. And as I said earlier, the lines have their own historians. When they have their own historians, naturally, the story that has been so far told could be said in different directions. And as we know very well, the history that now we talk of today, from Dalit to tribal and others, has not come overnight. It has been a serious effort by people of different sort in creating and generating this idea to come into fruition today, and it makes sense in different directions. And this not only come to an end with this particular idea, and I'm sure there are other groups who have lost their identity, would soon recover. Perhaps there is a scope, and this whole scope needs to be expanded. And the question of power, the question of recognizing or reconciling with the reality is a major challenge in which how do we address the question of hegemony. Lastly, but not the least, that I would emphasize the question of linguistic turn that we talk of very often in the postmodern circle makes real sense, particularly I think in the Tamil context, because language has been a major issue to a Tamil society since the modern times. And the issue has not only been as a language question, is more of a cultural political heritage. And this cultural political heritage needs to be given its adequate space for which history needs to be pushed through. The pushing of the history or bringing of the history to the fore naturally becomes the task of the intellectuals who happen to be the forebearers of Tamil civilization. So therefore, what I particularly emphasize to echo the sentiment or the voices of the subaltern, more needs to be done in order to bring many ideas. And in this direction, I think so, there are some archaeological excavations that are going on in some Tamil regions. I'm sure certainly will add a new fodder to the thinking in terms of reconstructing the history of the Tamil society much before 3rd century BC and back. So therefore, what I would like to particularly emphasize when we talk of linguistic aspirations with the language question of sensibility it is essential that we need to locate within the historical material that we work out. I mean to say is that bringing more and more historical ideas into the domain enables us to leverage oneself to claim more rights than one demand to have it. So therefore, what I would like to particularly emphasize the current the student community or the scholars are here. I think so there is a lot of scope, there is a tremendous job for in the days to come to engage in recovering the nation's last past so as to gain new sense of hope and possibility. Perhaps Velunachia, on which I think so how many pieces I have written, I do not know. Perhaps I recently corrected one of that, in which the adequate sources have not been brought in. Perhaps one of the reasons why we need to really work into these issues. I think so with appropriate historical documents or with the right documentation. That's what Helen Carr also emphasizes, that we need to certainly claim the history that has been hitherto denied of, for which needs more of intellectual effort, with which we may be able to push through various ideas and knowledge systems. And last but not the least, when we talk about the question of language as a matter of cultural identity, is a unique issue to every region. And every region has its own claim in terms of language and culture and civilization. Perhaps the Tamil claims have been perhaps better articulated these days than in the past. Perhaps I think so. It needs more to be articulated in terms of how language, as a matter of cultural pride, comes to work in the public life, though they may be engaged with other languages for their material existence. So therefore, these are all issues which certainly regions to region, the concern varies. Perhaps in the place where I teach, particularly till today, the question of communitarian identity in relation to material reality turns out to be a great issue. And that's why the political appeal or electoral claims all naturally evolves around those ideas. So therefore, what I would like to particularly emphasize, history in fact becomes the source for all our claims and all our rights. And authenticated history, I mean to say, in the modern sense, history with the right sources and appropriate facts enable us to recover the space that we have lost. And this is the hope that history brings in over the period. And that's how we see history has brought many communities to life from extinction. Many of them have lost or have gone with the wind, primarily because of losing their own historical claims. And that is how I think so history has a greater role to play in the days to come in a multicultural society like in India, where each community can claim and put forward its own history as a matter of its own pride, that in due course of time become the cultural bedrock of, or the knowledge bedrock of the entire federal system of India. I think so. With this particular assumption, that I may finally end up saying is that history needs to be relocated, not in terms of the way we think, but in the terms of the way we can relate with the issues and the way in which we bring those resources to support or buttress our argument. And along with our intellectual endeavor, it also is essential that we need to correlate the civilizational spirit with the existing knowledge paradigm. And that indeed would enable us to look for or creating space for recognizing the voices of the subaltern so that their history also be written, the history of subalterns also be written with all equal parity and respect, and which is possible. Perhaps across the world, we have been seeing all these developments taking shape in different directions, and India is not an exception. Perhaps one of the areas, the battle that we need to launch may be looking longer, but nevertheless, it's not a tougher one. And therefore, I think there is a great possibility that the hitherto disempowered groups also can raise or get the point. As I think so Aloysius said, nation without a nationalism also can create a own nationalism as it start recognizing the group interests in different ways. Perhaps this would enable us in the days to come to create a historical perspective across India in which the voices of everyone be heard, and therefore all the stakeholders will have equal citizenry status rather than having any other facilities. I think so. With these words of understanding, I would like to bring my address to conclusion. Thank you for your patient listening. And I think so. Facts alone may not make history, but facts are the central to our understanding of history that makes sense not only today, even in the days to come, and to our posterity. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for those awe-inspiring words sprinkled with great care and precision. Sir, if you don't mind, can you take a few questions, sir?
Yes, please. I'm prepared to take it. Yes.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. So, students, the floor is now open for discussion. So, if you have any queries, you can shoot out your questions to the speaker.
Good evening, sir.
Yes.
Yes, sir. First of all, thank you so much for this thought-provoking lecture. So my question is, it is not an exact question, but I want to know your thoughts. So according to our Indian Constitution, we know that Article 15 says that the state should not discriminate against any citizen based on their religion, race, caste, sex, or in any cause. So it is there, but we know that the actual reality is not that. It is total opposite. And what is your thoughts? Like, why there is this much gap between that theory, and why is it so hard to incorporate that in actual reality, like in a societal way?
Okay, thank you for the question. I think so. S.N. Banerjee wrote his biography, Nation in the Making, where he mentioned one interesting aspect is that no state can certainly build on its own past. It has to build its own present with an intention for future. So therefore, what I particularly emphasize, India is in the making, the state in its progression. So though it has a well-written constitution, but it is being implemented by people who share different worldviews. And therefore, what I particularly find it, India from its old set of ideas, now moving towards a set of new ideas as well, and within which we can also see some elements of obscurantist ideas together. So as a result of which, our own understanding of constitution by the interpreters, I mean to say the rulers or the bureaucrats who work with the and another court gives a different verdict. So means what I'm trying to say is that we have a well-knit system who happens to have their own privileges of ideas, privileging ideas and worldviews. And therefore, unless until we arrive at a point in which we begin to recognize each one's right as a fundamental, we may not be able to certainly achieve this equality, sense of equality, if not the practice. But what I particularly feel, though Indian state seems to be somewhere very unfair, but it's not now is absolutely as adamant it has been. So therefore, there is a flickering hope that Indian state can be certainly challenged. Perhaps you would be seeing the peasant struggle for about a year. And we know how that come to its own end. They paid a heavy cost. But the fact of the matter, given the limitations or given the leverages that we have within the our democratic setup, somewhere down the line, we were able to rewrite that political loss. And therefore, there is a possibility, the spirit of optimism hovers all over. And I think in days to come, India will become, if not more, a country which is more open to recognizing the different interests, and India can become more a country which is more moving towards the path of equitable position, creating an egalitarian possibilities. That is the hope that I exude.
Thank you so much, sir.
Sir, I have got a question for you.
Yes.
Sir, I would like to know if we should rewrite our history, and if yes, we should rewrite our history. So, from whose perspective should we rewrite our history? From the perspective of the government that is trying to synchronize the history that we have been able to read, write, and cherish so far, or from the perspective of the people who claim to be belonging to the marginalized community from our society?
Thank you for your question. See, first of all, one thing keep in mind, government cannot continue to be always sovereign. We know some 7, 8 years back, something else. So therefore, let us not take present as the final. Present is changing, and that's why history is always being rewritten. So our intention is not to rewritten. Our intention is to reclaim. To reclaim our interests or our rights, we need to certainly also sophisticate the way we do with research in history. Unless until we bring in new sources, new ideas, new ways of looking at it, we would be only rewriting the same thing. In the name of rewriting, we may be rephrasing it. Perhaps that is what's happening. Perhaps if you look at it, the modern Tamil Nadu history, I don't think so. Seriously, a history book that covers the entire gamut of what happened in the modern Tamil society, say from 19th century thereafter. What we have been following, perhaps I think so, some 30, 40 years. So similar set of works and similar set of ideas that have been circulated different titles. Perhaps I think so, rewriting history is not an easy task. Perhaps you see this current government been there for past 7 years or 8 years. They also keep on claiming that they want to rewrite the history. How much have they done? So therefore, what I suggest is history cannot be written by one set of people. It is written over the generations. So therefore, what I emphasize is that no one can overnight totally deny or destroy. But certainly they can damage. I agree with that. But there is an element of hope in which we can certainly invest. And we need to create enough intellectual rigor. Otherwise, we cannot certainly sustain history. Perhaps I think, perhaps if the South feels it is being not being wanted enough by the center, not because of center's obnoxiousness, but perhaps because the way the history of the Tamil needs to be much more vigorously be portrayed. Perhaps the question of Jallikattu, which has been seen as an animal sports. Whereas what is important, that needs to be shown how cultural sensibility is articulated through particular practice. Perhaps I think so, we make the nation. Perhaps who make the nation in which composition may change, but certainly we can constitute that composition. So that's why what I particularly feel, I think that there is a lot of intellectual input that we need to certainly invest so as to not so as to bring forth the ideas hitherto have been neglected, the point of views that have been so far ignored. Rewriting history naturally takes place, not by an agenda, but by our effort of including or bringing inclusiveness into our narration.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much for your answer, sir.
Thank you.
The students, any more questions? I think we'll wind up. So thank you so much, sir, for your patient answering to the questions of the students. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
Yes, sir. So the best and beautiful things in the world cannot be seen or even touched. They must be felt by the heart. Thank you is one such prayer among them. I consider it a great privilege and prestige to call forward Dr. R. Xavier, Assistant Professor, Department of History, to propose the vote of thanks. Please, sir.
Good evening, everyone. It's my privilege to have been asked to propose a vote of thanks on this occasion. It was a very nice evening. I hope that all of us has enjoyed the speech and pretty sure that you got something valuable about history of margins and the quest for identity. First of all, I'd like to extend a very hearty thanks to Honorable Chief Guest Dr. A. Gangadharan, Professor, Department of History, Banaras Hindu University, who blessed us with his presence and took out valuable time of his busy schedule. I hope his speech inspired the students present here. The way he explained the history of margins and the quest for identity, he touched a point like the rejection of tableau by Union government and not giving recognition to history. We really enjoyed and filled with knowledge on history of margins and framework on subaltern voices, and for his excellent input and for having shared with us his findings and opinion today. It was really a great intellectual virtual treat to all of us. Thank you, sir, for your very interesting and thought-provoking address.
Thank you, sir.
I'd like to express our profound gratitude to our principal, Father Thomas Subaltern, for his presence in this lecture. I should really mention at this point that he is a person whose support has all aspects. Despite having all valued ideas, he's the one who makes us to implement it. Thank you, Father. Thank you for your great support. And my sincere thanks to Dr. Melchius Gabriel, Deputy Principal, Loyola College, for his great support to have this event success. Thank you, sir, for your great encouragement. Next, I would like to take this opportunity to convey our heartfelt thanks to our resource persons of the day. Mr. P. Soynath, founder, editor, People's Archive of Rural India. Dr. Neeta Kandurkar, professor, University of Mumbai. Dr. M.N. Rogers, University of Hyderabad. We value your presence, and it was a great honor that you have accepted our invitation and participated in this today's event. We thank you sincerely for being with us today. On behalf of Department of History, I extend my thanks to them. Next, I would like to acknowledge our sincere gratitude to our beloved head of the department, Dr. D. Anuradha, women of perfection in organizing all programs, who always executes the best events for the benefit of the students and also for the staff members. She is a key role for this great event. She made such an effort to bring a department to that top level to make this event happen successfully with such a valued person in this dais. We really had great experiences and we are fully enriched with new insights. We support you to continue your vision and mission. Thank you, madam. We salute you for making this event good success. And I also express my thanks to Professor J. Ranganathan, Coordinator SIP2, for his moral support and guidance for making this lecture a great success. Here I should extend my gratitude to our own staff members of Department of History, the professors from other departments and various colleges who have made this lecture a grand success. Thank you so much. And I also thanks to all the paper presenters and all the organizers and student volunteers for their tireless effort towards the successful happening of today's lecture. Thank you so much for your cooperation for making this event grand success. As no program becomes successful without students, I also extend my thanks to our students from Department of History, SIP1 and SIP2, and students from various departments. Thank you, my dear students, for your active participation. Once again, I thank you all.
Thank you, sir, for being profoundly grateful and expressing gratitude on behalf of the department. Thank you so much, sir. So the greatest challenges humans face throughout their lives are two: the challenge of where to start and the challenge of when to stop. On behalf of the Department of History, I once again take this opportunity to thank all of you for the successful completion of day one of this conference. We'll meet once again tomorrow, fully recharged and energized to be part of yet another day of intellectual churning. Thanks a lot, everyone. Have a great evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeevit.
Thank you.
Dr. Gangadharan, a sincere thanks from on my behalf as well. Thank you for accepting our invite and being here. It was really interesting to listen to you, and we really hope to have you in person in our campus one day.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for giving an opportunity to present before your audience. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Thanks a lot. So we'll wind up today's session.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you.